Welcome to everyone from Odyssey and anyone else who might be joining us today. You're most welcome. What are the two questions that kids repeatedly ask their parents when they're on a long road trip? Are we almost there yet? And how much longer? And during this pandemic, this journey of ours in 2020 and 2021, I'm sure many of us are asking how much longer, and are we almost out of the woods yet? And one of the most difficult places in a journey can be this in-between phase of uncertainty. One church leader said of their transition, "We are between immense loss and what seems like a distant possibility of ever living a normal life again." And so I want to look at a story from the first book of the Bible, Genesis, because Romans 15 tells us that these stories are recorded for us to give us encouragement and endurance in our own journeys with God. And so this story is a night of Jacob where he is facing enormous uncertainty. Decades before, he's had to flee his own home because of the threat of his brother Esau wanting to kill him for what he's done. And so now he's returning and he's realizing that his brother is heading towards him with an army of 400 men. And so he sends groups of his own servants with huge amounts of livestock ahead of him so that hopefully Esau will encounter them and then will be softened up for when Jacob eventually meets him. And we read in Genesis 32 when he says to the first group that he sends, "When Esau my brother meets you and asks you, 'To whom do you belong? Where are you going? And whose are these ahead of you?' Then you shall say, 'They belong to your servant Jacob. They are presents sent to my lord Esau. And moreover, he is behind us.' He likewise instructed the second and the third and all who followed the droves. You shall say the same thing to Esau when you find him. And you shall say, 'Moreover, your servant Jacob is behind us. For he thought, I may appease him with the present that goes ahead of me, and afterwards I shall see his face. Perhaps he will accept me.' So the present passed on ahead of him, and he himself stayed that night in the camp." And so with that background to the story, let's read the story that we want to look at today. The same night he arose, that's Jacob, and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of that place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore to this day the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip and on the sinew of the thigh. Just before the story that we read, we told that one of the messengers of Jacob comes back to him, having seen Esau, and said, "Esau is coming towards you with 400 men. It says in verse 7, "Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed." And so as he sends his servants ahead to try and appease his brother, it says he stayed that night in the camp. In verse 22, the same night he arose and took his 2 wives. So it's like he's restless. He can't sleep. He has to keep on scheming of how he's going to make this thing work to his best advantage. And so he sends his 11 children and his wives and servants across the ford of the Jabbok River. The ford is a place that's shallow enough for you to safely cross. And now that everyone's in a secure place, it says, and Jacob was left alone. It's almost like a metaphoric picture of where Jacob's at this point in his journey back home. He's about to go back into the promised land, but something's still got to happen in his heart. And it's like he's come full circle, because when he left, when he fled for his life, when his brother threatened to kill him, it says in Genesis that he came to a certain place because it was night, and so he had to stop his journey, and he finds a rock and he puts his head on it, and then he has this incredible dream where this ladder that goes from earth into heaven has angels of God ascending and descending upon it. And it says, and the Lord was on top of the ladder and stood there and said to Jacob, this land that you've put your head on, I'm going to give to you and to all your offspring, and I'll make your offspring as numerous as the dust of the earth, and you'll spread out from the north to the south and from the east to the west, and I'll give you and your offspring this land, and through you all families of the earth shall be blessed. So God just reinforces what he had said to his father, his grandfather Abraham, and his father Isaac over many decades, but elaborates on it and makes it even more clear of what he wants to do. And then God gives Jacob a very personal word, because he knows he's afraid, he knows he's fleeing for his life, he knows he's in a wilderness where he could be eaten by wild animals. And he says, then I'll be with you, and I'll keep you, and I'll bring you back to this place that you're fleeing from, and I will not leave you until you have what I've promised you. And then we read that Jacob says, if God will be with me, if he will feed me and clothe me, and if he'll bring me back to this place in peace, to my father's house again, then he will be my God. And then he directs the next little line to God himself, and he says, and I will give you a full tenth of everything that you give me. It's like a tenth is a tenth, but Jacob's so generous in his heart that he's going to give God a full tenth of everything that God would give him. God's just promised him that he's going to give him the whole earth, in the sense that his descendants would be like the dust of the earth. They'd fill this place, and all the families of the earth would be blessed through him. And so as he's returning, he's on the edge of going back into the land of promise, the land of Canaan, at this place of this Jabbok River. It's as if God has still got a deal with a few things left in Jacob's heart. So it's not that God doesn't want to bless Jacob, and obviously Jacob wants the blessing, but is his heart in the right place to receive that blessing? And will he do with that blessing what God knows will be life-giving instead of soul-destroying? God has said to Abraham, I will bless you, I'll make your name great, I'll make of you a great nation, so that you can be a blessing, so that all families on the earth will be blessed through you. This blessing isn't for us, it's that we're conduits of God's blessing to touch the lives and families of all people around us, our neighbors and the nations. And so we read, and Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. It's just as suddenly this guy's upon him. It's like a preacher called Lee Eckloff says that there was no warning to Jacob of a pebble being disturbed. He was just suddenly grabbed from behind, and he must have thought, who is this that is attacking me? Who wants to take my life? Is it my brother Esau? But where are the 400 men? And then he realizes that this is not a kill-all match. This guy wants to wrestle with him until the breaking of day. My brother's recently been in hospital for COVID. I was touch and go at one stage. Thankfully, he was released on Friday, but he's got a bit more geography around his girth than he should have. And I was sharing a room with 4 other guys, and one day one guy asked him, are you a wrestler? And we have this picture of these sumo Japanese wrestlers who roll around on the mat with one another. I mean, if you've seen 2 grown men wrestling, it's quite a humorous sight, because you know that they are going to be taking their time as they roll on top of each other and push each other in the face and try and gain an ascendancy. And this man who starts off this wrestling match with Jacob, realizes that Jacob is a real fighter and he's not going to give up. And so he says when he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket. And Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. And so we realize that this guy could have done this earlier. He could have, it just touched his hip socket and was put out of joint. And so Jacob begins to realize that this is more than just some ordinary man. And this man says to Jacob, let me go, for the day has broken. It's like, why does he say that? It's because he doesn't want Jacob to see him face to face. God has shown himself to Jacob in a dream, and in that place of a dream he could see God in his dazzling splendor, but now he's close up with Jacob, and it's about to break open the next day, and he's saying, Jacob, let me go for your own good. And it's as if Jacob is hanging on to his leg as he hung on to Esau's heel as he came out of his mother's womb. And he's saying, I won't let you go until you bless me. But there was no blessing forthcoming. Instead, this man asked him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. And in Hebrew culture, names were very important. They spoke something about your identity. And we read that he got this name because even in his mother's womb, there was this jostling, there was this wrestling going on, that she even inquired of God, what's happening within me? And God tells Rebekah that the two nations are within her and they'll be at conflict with one another, and that the older will serve the younger. And as Esau comes out first, it says that Jacob is holding on to the heel of his twin brother. And so he is given this name, the heel grabber. And it would have reminded him as he spoke that out before this man that was how he had lived his whole life. He had cheated his brother out of his birthright. He had tricked his father to give him the blessing, the two things that were prized by an older brother in this culture. And as Jacob goes off to his uncle Laban, he finds that he gets some of his own medicine when Laban tricks him into having to marry his older daughter Leah first before he can get his prized love of his life, Rachel. There's a theologian who tells a story about one of his students who had cerebral palsy, and cerebral palsy causes you to have these involuntary limb movements and garbled speech. And this young guy came to this professor one day of his and said, I'm having a problem. And he said, well, let me pray for you. And he prayed, dear God, may this young man be able to work through this issue of his. And after the prayer, he looked up and this young guy was crying, and he asked him if he was all right. And he said, no one's ever called me a man before. And there's something of what happens next when Jacob's given this new name, that from being a heel grabber and a cheat, then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. And in my footnotes it says that Israel means either strive with God or God strives, and it's the latter that is preferred by some because of the way that the Hebrew words are structured, that it means that God strives on our behalf. And it's as if Jacob's in a place that he's ready to receive this new name, and he's ready to be blessed by this man, because he not only had he made a scheme to send his servants ahead with these gifts for his brother, but he had also significantly prayed in a way of dependence upon God. Because we read in verse 9, it says, and Jacob said, O God of my father Abram and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I've become 2 camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau. For I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, I will surely do you good, and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. It reminds me of a trip I went on when I was 17 years of age, a dream trip that my oldest brother Ralph and my dad had conspired together to send me to Southern California to go to a golf camp for 3 weeks. And when I returned back to New York to fly home, I was on standby because with the special fare ticket from my dad, it meant you weren't guaranteed a seat. You had to wait for one available. And the plane was full because it was the end of the school holidays. And so I made my way back to the city, stopped the taxi when the meter hit $4 because I realized I needed the money that I had to get back to the airport the following day. Couldn't stay at the hotel for free. Thought I was crazy when I asked. And so I wandered the streets of New York, fell asleep on a park bench to be awakened by a policeman telling me this is not the place to sleep in the city. And so I approached the desk the next day of the representative of the airlines and told him my plight. And he said, well, we'll see if there's an empty seat. And lo and behold, there wasn't. The plane was full again. And I remember in my heart not crying a prayer of, please God, get me on because of that, but something of this prayer of, God, but you're my Father. And I prayed and asked you, and you should have put me on that airplane because I have no more money left. I have nowhere to sleep. And I have to get back to write my prelim matric exams. And it's if, and I like to believe in hindsight, that at that point, God's angels popped the wheels of that big jumbo 747 because it had to turn around and come back to have the wheels repaired. It couldn't take off. And because one businessman couldn't afford to lose that one night, he vacated the seat that he had, and that was the seat that was given to me the next day. I was able to sleep that night at the house of that representative because he understood the position that I was in. And so that story, something of a memorial marker for me, that God turned a situation around beyond the 12th hour and responded to a prayer that was calling upon who he was in terms of his nature and character. And I believe that, Jacob story is one of like a memorial marker because in verse 32 it says, therefore to this day the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh. And Jacob, as he would have repeated this story of how God had graciously given the whole people of Israel this new name, that God had taken Abraham, who had not trusted fully in God's promises, who tried to scheme his own way, that Sarah said to him, sleep with your servant Hagar and then you'll have a child of promise. And God later, when he makes a covenant with Abraham in Genesis chapter 15, he puts Abraham to sleep so that Abraham knows, and this is totally of God. And God says to him, and your heir will come from your own flesh and blood. Even as Abraham has schemed to make Eliezer the heir, one of the servants, so that this promise that God gives him can come to pass. And God has to bring Abraham, he has to bring Jacob to the end of themselves, to their own schemes, to their own plans, to their own ways of trying to make God's promises work, so that they can see it's completely according to God's grace. It's because of what God wants to do. It's because what God's promised that it will come to pass, but in God's way and in God's timing. C.S. Lewis was a brilliant Oxford scholar who lived in the last century and was an agnostic before his conversion. And he describes his conversion experience that he had one night like this. You must picture me alone in that room in Magdalen, night after night, feeling, whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him of whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, May the 22nd, I gave in and admitted that God was God, and knelt and prayed, perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. I did not then see what is now the most shining and obvious thing: the divine humility which will accept a convert on such terms. The prodigal son at least walked home on his own feet. But who can duly adore that love with a capital L, which will open the high gates to a prodigal who is brought in kicking, struggling, resentful, and darting his eyes in every direction for a chance of escape? The hardness of God is kinder than the softness of men, and his compassion is our liberation. And so you can imagine Jacob, who took on some of his father's habits of lying and conniving and working out the schemes of God to suit his own ways, is shown this incredible grace by God, first in this dream as he sets off on this journey alone, and as he returns alone at night in this space again, and that God comes and wrestles with him. And it says that God strives, that his name would be called Israel, and every time the nation Israel would hear their name called after that, they would hear that God strives on your behalf, that God takes you not because of who you are, because of what you've done, or because of your performance, but because of his promise, because of his grace, because of his graciousness, because of his love towards you, that he's chosen as this people that will be a light, a shining light to the nations surrounding you. What an incredible God that we serve. Jacob is not only given this new name, but it says, and then the man blessed him. And in verse 30, so Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, and Peniel means the face of God. And Jacob says, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. And he doesn't mean my life has been delivered from the fact that I encountered God face to face, that because no man can see God's face and live, but rather it's the same word that he uses in his prayer in verse 11 when he says, please deliver me from the hand of my brother. So he's saying, I've been delivered because I have encountered God in this close way. I've met him face to face. I've believed his promises in the past in maybe a cerebral way, but now I know them deep in my heart. I know that God strives for me, that he would come to me in the night and wrestle with me to give me this reassurance at my most desperate and terrified hour when I'm fearing for my life. And when he had said earlier in verse 20, or he thought, I may appease Esau with the present that goes ahead of me, and afterwards I shall see his face. Perhaps he will accept me. So the present passed on ahead of him, and himself stayed that night in the camp. So he was saying, I'll see Esau's face and perhaps he will accept me. But now he's seeing God's face and he knows God's accept him. So he's able to face Esau. And when we read on in chapter 23, it says, and Jacob lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming and 400 men with him. This is a dramatic introduction. He's just had this encounter with God in the night. And straight away he looks up, the text says, and he sees Jacob with this army that he's so fearful of. And verse 2, and he put the servants with their children in front, then Leah with her children, and Joseph was last of all. He himself went on before them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. But Esau ran to meet him, embraced him, and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And so there's this incredible reunion, and you wonder if did God change Esau's heart in the night? I mean, was Esau out to get his brother with this army of 400 men? And when he saw him, there was this compassion that overwhelmed him because of this encounter that Jacob had the night before with God. If you're trying to save a person who's drowning and they're desperate and flailing their arms, and if you swim towards them and grab them, they'll grasp onto you and the two of you can go down together and end up drowning. Instead, you should stop just before he can reach you, dive underneath him, come up from behind, move up his legs, grab him around the chest, punch him hard under the arm so that he goes limp, and you can drag him off to shore safely. And it's like God had to disable Jacob in a similar sense, the striving, flailing, fighting Jacob who had schemed his way through life. God had to put his hip out of joint so that God could bring him to a safe place, so that he could rise the next day. It says in verse 31, the sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel. limping because of his hip, he would have remembered this encounter with God, this gracious God who helped him to come to a realization that it's God who strives on his behalf. And God shines his face and his love on you and I today through Jesus. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 4:6, and he says that the knowledge of the glory of God is in the face of Christ. And so we want to also encounter God face to face. We want to have these moments where we are arrested by God, and when we come to the end of ourselves and we throw ourselves dependently upon him, it's then that we can experience more of Jesus in our lives. And as we read of him and engage with him in the Gospels, that we come to know him, that he is for us, that his promises will prevail, that he is returning one day, that we're in this in-between phase, but he has promised that he'll come back and there'll be a new earth. Well, there'll be no coronavirus, no sickness, no death, and we will enjoy his presence forever. And so I just want to end with that benediction that God told Aaron to speak over the people of Israel in the book of Numbers, where he said, "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace."